August 15, 1943. The massive deck of the USS Essex pitches violently in the rolling Pacific swells 200 miles off the coast of Hawaii. Lieutenant James Thatch grips the side of his brand-new F6F Hellcat fighter, its engine idling with a steady growl that sends vibrations through the soles of his feet. The flight deck crew gives him the signal. It's time. Heart pounding in his chest, the sweat beading on his forehead, isn't just from the punishing tropical heat. This is his first carrier takeoff in the Navy's newest fighter aircraft, and he has exactly 3 hours of training in this particular plane. As the deck officer's checkered flag drops, Thatch slams the throttle forward. The Hellcat's massive 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney engine roars to life, propelling the 7-ton fighter down the pitching deck. His knuckles turn white on the control stick as the end of the carrier rushes toward him. Nothing but endless ocean beyond. The aircraft breaks free just as the deck ends, dipping momentarily toward the waves before clawing its way upward into the blue Pacific sky. The sound of Thatch's ragged breathing fills his oxygen mask. He's airborne. Barely. Now comes the real test. Can he successfully fly this complex machine in simulated combat, land it safely back on the carrier, and train hundreds of other pilots to do the same, all while the urgent demands of war give him precious little time? In just 4 months, these pilots will be facing the elite of the Imperial Japanese Navy over the Marshall Islands. No one in the Pacific Fleet understood that morning how Lieutenant Thatch was about to revolutionize the way fighter pilots would train for carrier operations. His unauthorized training methods would slash the normal 6-month qualification period to just 8 weeks, producing combat-ready Hellcat pilots at a pace previously thought impossible. By war's end, his training innovations would save countless American lives and help turn the tide of the air war in the Pacific. James Flatley Thatch was born in Pine Bluff, Arkansas in 1905 to a family with modest means but strong values. The son of a local doctor, young Jimmy grew up with stories of his father treating patients regardless of their ability to pay, instilling in him a deep sense of service and duty. His childhood in small-town America was defined by baseball games in empty fields, fishing in local streams, and an early fascination with the emerging world of aviation. When Charles Lindbergh made his historic transatlantic flight in 1927, 22-year-old Thatch had already set his sights on becoming a pilot. After graduating from the United States Naval Academy in 1927, Thatch initially served on battleships and cruisers, as was customary for new officers, but he couldn't shake his dream of flying. In 1930, he applied for flight training at Naval Air Station Pensacola, the crucible where naval aviators were forged. The training was brutally selective. Only the most promising officers were accepted, and many of those washed out before earning their wings. Thatch's instructors quickly noted his unusual aptitude. While other cadets struggled with basic maneuvers, he displayed a natural feel for aircraft control that couldn't be taught. More importantly, he demonstrated an analytical mind that constantly questioned established doctrine. "Why do we approach landings this way?" he would ask. "What if we tried a different method?" This questioning nature didn't always endear him to his more traditional instructors, but it marked him as someone special. After earning his wings, Thatch joined Fighter Squadron 2 aboard the USS Lexington. The Navy of the 1930s was a peacetime organization where tradition reigned supreme, and innovation was often viewed with suspicion. Junior officers were expected to follow procedures developed by their superiors, not challenge them. But even then, Thatch stood out for his willingness to experiment with new tactical approaches. He would often stay up late in his quarters, moving matchsticks around on his bunk to visualize new fighter formations and defensive maneuvers. His fellow pilots initially viewed this behavior with skepticism. "Thatch is always thinking too much," one squadron mate commented. "Flying is about instinct and guts, not academic theories." But as Thatch demonstrated his ideas during training flights, gradually proving their effectiveness, That skepticism transformed into respect. By 1940, he had risen to become the commander of Fighting Squadron 3, one of the Navy's elite fighter units. When war erupted with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Thatch was already developing the tactical formation that would later bear his name, the Thatch Weave, a defensive maneuver that allowed outperformed American fighters to successfully combat the more nimble Japanese Zeros. This innovation alone would save countless American pilots, demonstrating Thatch's genius for practical problem-solving under pressure. But by mid-1943, Thatch faced perhaps his greatest challenge. The Navy was introducing the F6F Hellcat, designed specifically to counter the Japanese Zero. The massive 7-ton fighter was a significant improvement over previous American designs, with a powerful engine, heavy armor, and 650 caliber machine guns. It had the potential to wrest control of the Pacific skies from Japan, but only if enough pilots could be trained to fly it effectively in combat conditions. And therein lay the problem. Traditional Navy pilot training methods were thorough but slow, requiring approximately 6 months to qualify a pilot for carrier operations in a new aircraft type. With the war intensifying across the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz made it clear that such time frames were no longer acceptable. "We need Hellcat pilots in the fight by October," he told his air staff in June 1943. "Not next year, not in 6 months. October." Thatch, now promoted to lieutenant commander based on his combat record and tactical innovations, was assigned to develop an accelerated training program for the new fighter. Many senior officers considered Nimitz's timeline impossible and potentially dangerous. "You can't rush carrier qualification," one training commander insisted. "It takes as long as it takes. Rush it, and you'll kill more pilots in training than the Japanese will in combat." Yet Thatch saw opportunity where others saw only constraints. He had been silently observing the existing training program and had identified numerous inefficiencies and outdated practices. He believed that with a complete reimagining of how pilots were trained, Nimitz's seemingly impossible deadline might just be achievable. But he would have to challenge virtually every aspect of established naval aviation training doctrine to make it happen. His approach would either revolutionize fighter pilot training or end his promising career. No one could have predicted that his unauthorized training innovations would ultimately change the course of the Pacific Air War. By the summer of 1943, the United States was fully engaged in its island-hopping campaign across the Pacific. The brutal battles of Guadalcanal and Tarawa had demonstrated that wresting control of Japanese-held islands would come at a terrible cost in American lives. Admiral Chester Nimitz and General Douglas MacArthur understood that air superiority was not just advantageous, it was essential. Without control of the skies, American ships would be vulnerable to Japanese aircraft, and ground troops would face the nightmare of enemy bombing without protection. The Imperial Japanese Navy's air arm had entered the war with the fearsome A6M-0, a fighter aircraft that had shocked American pilots with its exceptional maneuverability and long range. In the war's early engagements, the Zero had established clear superiority over the U.S. Navy's F4F Wildcat, outclimbing, outturning, and generally outfighting the American fighter. Only through the development of specific tactics, like the Thatch Weave, and by taking advantage of the Wildcat's few strengths, had American pilots managed to achieve even near parity in the skies. The Grumman Aircraft Corporation had been tasked with developing a fighter that could definitively counter the Zero. Their answer was the F6F Hellcat, which first flew in June 1942 and began production later that year. The Hellcat represented a quantum leap in capability. Its Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, nearly double the Wildcat's output. It could reach speeds of 375 miles per hour, climb at over 3,000 feet per minute, and carry 650 caliber machine guns that could tear through an enemy aircraft in seconds. Unlike the Zero, The Hellcat was heavily armored, with self-sealing fuel tanks that could absorb enemy fire without exploding. A Hellcat pilot could survive hits that would have been fatal in earlier fighters, but these advantages came with complexities. The aircraft was larger, heavier, and more powerful than anything most Navy pilots had ever flown. Its systems were more numerous and complicated, requiring a deeper technical understanding from its pilots. The strategic situation in the Pacific added its own pressures. The Joint Chiefs of Staff had approved Operation Galvanic, the invasion of the Gilbert Islands, including Tarawa and Macon, to begin in November 1943. These would be followed by Operation Flintlock, targeting the Marshall Islands in January 1944. Both operations would depend heavily on carrier-based air power. The Navy needed 6 new carrier air groups equipped with Hellcats and ready for combat operations by the fall of 1943. This timeline collided with sobering realities. The established training pipeline for carrier fighter pilots was lengthy and methodical. First, candidates completed basic flight training, requiring approximately 8 months. Then came advanced training in a combat aircraft type, taking another 4 months. Finally, specific carrier qualification training required 2 additional months. All told, creating a combat-ready carrier pilot typically took at least 14 months from the time a candidate first entered flight school. Even for experienced pilots transitioning to the Hellcat from other aircraft, the standard conversion training took 6 months. With the Marshall's operation scheduled for January 1944, pilots needed to be combat-ready in the Hellcat by December 1943 at the latest. Working backward from this deadline, training needed to begin immediately and be completed in half the normal time. The Navy's training command was facing unprecedented demands. At the Pearl Harbor Naval Base, the commander of air training, Captain Wallace Beakley, called an emergency meeting of his staff in June 1943. "Gentlemen, we've been ordered to produce 600 Hellcat pilots by November," he announced to the stunned room. "That's 4 times our normal rate, with half the normal training time." The training officers exchanged uneasy glances. "Sir, that's simply not possible with our established procedures," one commander objected. "We'd be sending half-trained pilots to their deaths." Captain Beakley nodded grimly. "I understand your concerns, but these orders come directly from Admiral Nimitz. The timetable for the Central Pacific Offensive is fixed. Either we find a way to prepare these pilots, or the operations proceed with inadequate air cover." In the back of the room, Lieutenant Commander James Thatch listened intently. As a decorated combat veteran and tactical innovator, he had been temporarily assigned to the training command to provide real-world combat insights. While others saw only impossibility, Thatch was already formulating ideas. The traditional training system had evolved in peacetime, prioritizing thoroughness over efficiency. But war demanded different calculations. After the meeting, Thatch approached Captain Beakley. "Sir, I believe I can develop a training program that meets the Admiral's timeline without compromising safety," he said. Beakley looked skeptical, but desperate for solutions. "You have 1 week to present me with a detailed proposal, Commander," he replied. "But I warn you, the training command has procedures developed over decades. Any changes will face significant resistance." Thatch understood the challenge ahead. He would have to overcome not just the technical problems of accelerated training, but also the institutional inertia of a Navy that viewed tradition as sacrosanct. The lives of hundreds of young pilots and potentially the outcome of crucial Pacific battles hung in the balance. What Thatch didn't yet realize was that his training innovations would not only meet the immediate crisis, but fundamentally transform how fighter pilots would be trained for generations to come. The following day, Thatch began his assessment of the existing Hellcat training program at Naval Air Station Barbers Point in Hawaii. Rising before dawn, he observed every aspect of the operation, from classroom instruction to maintenance procedures to flight operations. What he saw troubled him deeply. Despite the urgent demands of wartime, training was proceeding at a leisurely, peacetime pace. In the main hangar, 25 Hellcats sat idle while instructors delivered lengthy lectures on aircraft systems. "This carburetor theory lesson will continue tomorrow," announced Lieutenant Harrison to 30 pilots sitting on uncomfortable metal chairs. Thach checked his watch. These pilots had been in the classroom for 4 hours without touching an aircraft. Outside, perfect flying weather was being wasted. "How many actual flying hours do students get per week?" Thach asked a nearby instructor. "About 6 to 8, sir," replied Lieutenant Ellis Parker, a seasoned instructor. "The syllabus calls for extensive ground training before significant flight time." Thach frowned. "And how many aircraft do we have available?" 42 Hellcats assigned to training, sir." A quick calculation told Thach that the expensive fighters were being utilized less than 3 hours per day, despite 12 hours of available daylight. Meanwhile, the training schedule showed carrier qualification, the most critical phase, not beginning until week 16 of the program. That evening, Thach met with Lieutenant Commander William Gus Wiedhelm, another combat veteran who had been shot down twice in the Solomon Islands campaign before being assigned to training duty. Wiedhelm's experience as a survivor of intense air combat made him particularly valuable. "We're doing this all wrong, Gus," Thach said, as they reviewed the training manual in his quarters. "We're training these boys like it's 1938. Look at this, 3 weeks on aircraft recognition when they're only going to face 3 or 4 types of Japanese aircraft. 2 weeks on radio procedure when combat experience shows most engagements happen with minimal radio chatter." Wiedhelm nodded in agreement. "And they're teaching textbook maneuvers that will get pilots killed against zeros. I've tried telling the training staff, but they insist on following the established curriculum." Over the next 3 days, Thach and Wiedhelm completely dissected the training program, identifying inefficiencies and outdated concepts. They distilled their findings into a radical proposal that would fundamentally alter how Hellcat pilots were trained. On the morning of June 28, 1943, they presented their conclusions to Captain Beakley and the senior training staff. "Gentlemen," Thach began, standing before a room of skeptical faces, "I believe we can reduce Hellcat qualification training from 24 weeks to 8 weeks without compromising pilot readiness for combat." A murmur of disbelief swept through the room. Commander Harold Jensen, the head of the training curriculum department, spoke first. "That's impossible, Commander Thach. You're proposing to cut 2/3 of our established program." "Not cut, Commander. Refocus," Thach replied calmly. "Our current program was designed in peacetime, where fuel conservation and aircraft preservation were priorities. In wartime, our priority must be producing combat-ready pilots in the shortest possible time." Thach unveiled his proposal. First, he would reverse the ratio of ground school to flight time. Currently, pilots spent 70% of their training hours in classrooms and 30% flying. Thach proposed the opposite, 70% in the air and 30% on the ground. Second, he would focus classroom instruction exclusively on combat critical knowledge, eliminating nice-to-know information in favor of need-to-know essentials. Third, and most controversially, he proposed beginning carrier landing practice in the first week of training, rather than waiting until week 16. "The single most important skill for a naval aviator is carrier landing," Thach explained. "It should be practiced from the beginning, not treated as an advanced skill learned at the end." "That's completely backwards," objected Commander Jensen, his face reddening. "We've always taught basic flight skills first, then advanced maneuvers, and finally carrier operations. You're suggesting we start with the most difficult aspect of naval aviation." "Precisely," Thach replied, "because if a pilot cannot master carrier landings, nothing else matters. We waste months training pilots in tactics and navigation only to wash them out during carrier qualification. I propose we identify those who can't handle carrier operations immediately, allowing us to focus resources on those who can." The room erupted in objections. Captain Beakley raised his hand for silence. "Continue, Commander Thach. What else are you proposing?" Thach outlined additional innovations, utilizing aircraft 16 hours daily through night training, creating specialized instructors who taught only one aspect of flight operations rather than general instructors, and implementing A train the best, wash out the rest philosophy that would identify the most promising candidates quickly. This approach flies in the face of decades of naval aviation training doctrine, said Commander Jensen when Thatch finished. It's reckless and untested. So was sending Wildcats against Zeros, Thatch countered. War demands adaptation, gentlemen. Captain Beakley studied the proposal silently. Finally, he spoke. The approach is unorthodox, but these are unorthodox times. Commander Jensen, what specific safety concerns do you have? Jensen enumerated a list of objections, focusing particularly on the compressed time frame for systems knowledge and emergency procedures. Thatch listened carefully, acknowledging valid concerns while challenging others based on his combat experience. After 2 hours of intense debate, Captain Beakley made his decision. Commander Thatch, your approach is too radical to implement program-wide without validation. However, I'll authorize a test program. You'll be given 50 student pilots and resources to implement your methods. Commander Jensen's conventional program will continue with the remaining students. In 8 weeks, we'll evaluate the results. Thatch understood this was the best outcome possible. Thank you, sir. We'll begin immediately. The following morning, 50 newly arrived pilots were assembled in Hangar 3 at Barber's Point. Most were directly from basic flight training, with minimal experience in military aircraft and none in fighters. Among them was Ensign Thomas Riley, a 22-year-old from Boston who had joined the Navy the day after Pearl Harbor. Gentlemen, Thatch addressed them, you've been selected for an accelerated Hellcat training program. It will be the most demanding 8 weeks of your lives. Some of you won't make it through. But those who do will be combat-ready carrier pilots in 2 months instead of 6. Our Pacific Fleet needs you in the fight sooner rather than later. He pointed to the flight line where 12 Hellcats sat ready. Traditional training would keep you in classrooms for weeks before letting you near these aircraft, not us. This afternoon, each of you will fly a Hellcat. A mixture of excitement and anxiety rippled through the group. Ensign Riley felt his pulse quicken. He had barely mastered the basic S&J trainer, and now he'd be flying the Navy's most advanced fighter in a matter of hours? Before that happens, Thatch continued, you'll receive exactly 3 hours of ground instruction on critical systems and emergency procedures. Nothing more, nothing less. We're going to teach you what you absolutely need to know to keep the aircraft flying. Everything else, you'll learn as we go. The intensive 3-hour briefing followed, conducted by Lieutenant Vidhelm. No technical manuals were distributed. Instead, pilots were taught using a functional Hellcat cockpit removed from a damaged aircraft. Each control, gauge, and switch was physically touched and operated as its function was explained. Forget theory, Vidhelm told them. If this needle moves into the red, do this. If this light illuminates, do that. If the engine makes this sound, do these 3 steps immediately. The instruction was brutally practical, focusing exclusively on what pilots needed to survive their first flights. By mid-afternoon, as promised, the first students were climbing into Hellcats with instructors in adjacent aircraft. Ensign Riley was paired with Thatch himself. Sir, I've only got 40 flight hours total, Riley admitted nervously as he strapped in. Are you sure I'm ready for this? Thatch smiled reassuringly. No, you're not ready. And that's precisely the point, Ensign. In combat, you'll face situations you're not ready for. We're teaching you to handle aircraft beyond your experience level from day one. Riley's first flight was terrifying and exhilarating. The Hellcat's power was unlike anything he'd experienced. The acceleration pinned him to his seat, and the sensitivity of the controls made the fighter respond to the slightest touch. He overcontrolled constantly, making the aircraft buck and weave. But with Thatch's calm guidance via radio, he managed to keep the fighter airborne and under some semblance of control. After an hour, Thatch directed him back to Barber's Point. Now for the most important part, Ensign. I want you to perform a carrier approach to the runway. Sir, we haven't covered carrier approaches yet. You've had 3 minutes of instruction on them. Now you'll have your first practice. Follow my lead exactly. Thatch demonstrated the approach in his own Hellcat. a precisely controlled descent at higher than normal speed, with a steeper than standard approach angle, followed by a quick flare and firm touchdown. Then it was Riley's turn. The young ensign's attempt was clumsy. He came in too fast, flared too high, and bounced twice on the runway. In traditional training, such a performance would result in weeks of remedial practice before attempting again. But as soon as he taxied clear, Thatch's voice came over the radio. "Take off again immediately, Riley. We're doing another one." By sunset, Riley had performed 8 takeoffs and carrier-style landings. The last one was barely acceptable by normal standards, but showed marked improvement. As he shut down the Hellcat's engine, his flight suit was soaked with sweat, and his arms trembled from exertion and stress. But he felt a strange, new confidence. He had just flown one of the world's most powerful fighter aircraft for 3 hours on his first day of training. Across the flight line, similar scenes played out with the other students. By day's end, all 50 had flown at least one Hellcat sortie. 3 had performed so poorly that they were immediately transferred out of the program. Another 5 were given one more chance the following day. That evening, Commander Jensen visited the flight line to observe the results of Thatch's unorthodox first day. "This is reckless, Jim," he told Thatch, as they watched the maintenance crews preparing aircraft for the next day. "These boys barely know what they're doing up there." "That's exactly right, Harold," Thatch replied. "And tomorrow they'll know a little more, and the day after that, a little more still. We're compressing months of gradual skill acquisition into days of intensive experience. It's not pretty, but it works." "And what about their knowledge of aircraft systems, emergency procedures, navigation?" "We're teaching those concurrently, in small, practical doses directly tied to each day's flying. Tomorrow morning, they'll get exactly 45 minutes of emergency procedures relevant to their planned flights, then straight back into the cockpit." Jensen shook his head in disbelief. "You're gambling with their lives, Jim." "No," Thatch responded firmly. "I'm gambling with their training time. The enemy is gambling with their lives." By the end of the first week, Thatch's methods had claimed 10 washouts, pilots who simply couldn't adapt to the accelerated pace. But the remaining 40 had progressed at an astounding rate. They were already performing basic combat maneuvers that the conventional program wouldn't introduce until week 6. The second week brought the first true test of Thatch's approach. Captain Beakley had arranged for the training carrier, USS Wolverine, to be available in Hawaiian waters for 2 days. Converted from a side-wheel passenger steamer for use as a training carrier, the Wolverine had a flight deck just 460 feet long, 2/3 the length of a fleet carrier. "You're putting students with barely 10 hours in Hellcats onto that postage stamp?" Commander Jensen asked incredulously when he learned of the plan. "Standard procedure is a minimum of 100 hours before carrier qualification attempts." Thatch stood firm. "The sooner they face the real challenge of carrier landings, the sooner we'll know who can hack it." On July 12th, 38 student pilots were scheduled to attempt their first actual carrier landings. The mood aboard the USS Wolverine was tense as the ship steamed into the wind, 20 miles off Oahu. Lieutenant Commander Vidhelm briefed the landing signal officers, experienced aviators who would guide the students aboard with hand signals. "These boys have about 90 hours less experience than you're used to seeing," Vidhelm explained. "Be ready to wave them off at the slightest sign of trouble." Ensign Riley was scheduled as the 10th pilot to attempt a landing. From his cockpit, circling above the carrier, the Wolverine's deck looked impossibly small, a tiny rectangle pitching gently on the vast Pacific. When his turn came, he followed the approach path exactly as practiced, eyes locked on the landing signal officer at the ship's stern. At the critical moment, just as his Hellcat crossed the ship's stern, the LSO's paddles crossed in the signal to abort the landing. Riley immediately applied full power, feeling the aircraft sink momentarily before the powerful engine thrust it skyward again, clearing the deck by mere feet. His heart hammered in his chest as he climbed away to rejoin the landing pattern. Thatch's voice came over the radio. "Too flat on approach, Riley. Remember, keep your nose down until the last second, eyes on the LSO. Try again." On his second attempt, Riley's aircraft slammed onto the deck with bone-jarring force. The tailhook caught the third wire, and the Hellcat jerked to a stop. He had done it, his first carrier landing. As deck crew signaled him forward to clear the landing area, Riley's hands were shaking so badly he could barely control the aircraft. The day's operations continued with a mixture of successes and failures. 5 students never managed a successful landing, despite multiple attempts. They would be transferred to land-based squadrons. Another 7 completed landings but demonstrated such difficulty that they were flagged for additional intensive practice. The remaining 26, including Riley, had passed their first carrier qualification test in record time. When they returned to Barber's Point that evening, the atmosphere among the students had changed. There was a new, quiet confidence. They had faced one of naval aviation's greatest challenges and succeeded, but there was no time to celebrate. Thach's program ground on relentlessly, with night flying operations scheduled until midnight. By the 4th week, the conventional training program was taking notice of the extraordinary progress being made by Thach's students. While their own trainees were still primarily in classrooms and performing basic flight maneuvers, Thach's pilots were engaging in complex tactical exercises and simulated combat against instructors flying as Japanese enemies. Captain Beakley visited during a simulated combat exercise and watched with amazement as students with barely 100 hours of total flight time executed combat formations and maneuvers that traditionally weren't introduced until near the end of training. They're rough around the edges, Thach admitted as they observed, but they're learning the critical skills in the right order. Survival first, refinement later. The transformation was perhaps most evident in Ensign Riley. The uncertain student who had climbed into a Hellcat for the first time 1 month earlier now led a 4-plane division in mock combat with confident skill. His landings, while not elegant, were safe and consistent. More importantly, he was developing the situational awareness and rapid decision-making that separated survivors from casualties in actual combat. But as the program reached its midpoint, an incident threatened to derail everything Thach had built. During a night training flight in deteriorating weather, one of the students, Ensign William Cooper, became disoriented and crashed into the sea 15 miles off Oahu. Although he was rescued with only minor injuries, the accident gave Commander Jensen and other critics the ammunition they needed. An emergency safety review was called. Thach found himself defending his entire program before a panel of senior officers, many skeptical of his methods from the beginning. The central question was stark. Was Thach's accelerated program sacrificing safety for speed? "Commander," began the senior member of the panel, Admiral William Halsey's Chief of Staff, "you've compressed 6 months of training into weeks. Now we have a pilot in the hospital who had no business flying a complex fighter in challenging night conditions. How do you justify this approach?" Thach took a deep breath. This was the moment that would either validate or end his program. Everything he believed about pilot training and the urgent needs of the Pacific Fleet hung in the balance. Thach stood before the safety review panel, his posture rigid but confident. Behind him, through the windows of the Pearl Harbor Administration Building, aircraft could be seen taking off and landing on Ford Island, a constant reminder of the war's unrelenting pace. "Gentlemen," Thach began, "I don't minimize the seriousness of Ensign Cooper's accident. Any training incident demands our closest scrutiny. However, I believe viewing this single event in isolation provides an incomplete picture." He placed a folder on the table. "These are the accident statistics from both training programs, the conventional method and our accelerated approach, normalized for flight hours and activities." The panel members leaned forward as they examined the data. Thach continued, "As you can see, our accident rate per 1,000 flight hours is 4.3 incidents. The conventional program's rate is 4.1. The difference is statistically insignificant, despite our students performing advanced maneuvers much earlier in their training." Commander Jensen interjected, "But your students have accumulated far more flight hours in a compressed time frame, meaning a higher absolute number of incidents." "That's correct," Thatch acknowledged. Our students average 62 flight hours per week compared to 14 in the conventional program. They're getting the experience they need faster, which is precisely the point. Admiral Raymond Spruance, who had joined the panel unexpectedly, spoke for the first time. Commander Thatch, let's cut to the heart of the matter. In your professional judgment, are the pilots emerging from your accelerated program combat ready? Thatch met the Admiral's gaze steadily. Sir, I believe they are. Not with the polish and refinement of pilots with 6 months of training, but with the essential skills to survive and succeed in combat. The Pacific Fleet needs Hellcat pilots now, not perfect pilots 6 months from now. Spruance nodded thoughtfully. And what metrics are you using to assess combat readiness? 3 primary measures, Admiral. First, proficiency in carrier operations, takeoffs and landings under various conditions. Second, aircraft handling skills, the ability to extract maximum performance from the Hellcat in combat scenarios. Third, tactical understanding, knowing when and how to engage, disengage, and support wingmen. Thatch flipped to another page in his report. By these metrics, 21 of our remaining 32 students are already performing at levels that meet or exceed the graduation standards of the conventional program. The others are on track to reach that level within the next 3 weeks. The room fell silent as the panel members digested this information. Finally, Admiral Spruance spoke again. I appreciate data, Commander, but I'd like your personal assessment. If you were leading a combat division tomorrow, would you trust these accelerated program pilots at your wing? Without hesitation, Thatch replied, Yes, sir, I would. In fact, I'd prefer them in many cases. They've been trained specifically for wartime realities, not peacetime procedures. The Admiral nodded slowly. Thank you, Commander. That will be all for now. As Thatch left the hearing room, he had no way of knowing if his program would continue. He spent the evening preparing contingency plans for integrating his students into the conventional program if necessary. But the next morning, Captain Beakley summoned him to his office. The panel has made its decision, Jim, Beakley said without preamble. Admiral Spruance was particularly impressed with your data and your conviction. The accelerated program will continue with some modest safety adjustments. Thatch felt a wave of relief. Thank you, sir. What adjustments are required? Nothing major. Additional instructor presence during night operations and slightly more emphasis on emergency procedures training. But there's more, Jim. Beakley handed him a document bearing Admiral Nimitz's signature. Effective immediately, your program is being expanded. You're to scale up to handle 200 students by next month with the goal of producing over 1,000 accelerated Hellcat pilots by year's end. Thatch scanned the orders with amazement. This is far beyond what we've tested, Captain. We'll need more aircraft, more instructors. You'll have them? Beakley interrupted. Admiral Nimitz has made this a top priority. The Marshall Islands operation depends on it. The enormity of the task ahead dawned on Thatch. His experimental program was about to become the primary pipeline for fighter pilots in the Pacific Theater. The responsibility was staggering. There's one more thing, Beakley added. Commander Jensen has requested transfer to a combat command. He feels his expertise would be better utilized elsewhere. Thatch understood the subtext. His most vocal critic was effectively conceding the argument. Jensen is an excellent officer, sir. He'll serve well in a fleet role. Indeed, and that creates a vacancy in the training command leadership, which you'll be filling. Congratulations, Commander. You're now officially in charge of all Hellcat training for the Pacific Fleet. The next 6 weeks saw Thatch working 18-hour days to scale his program. Additional instructors were recruited, primarily combat veterans, rotated back from carrier duty. More Hellcats were diverted from delivery to combat units, prioritizing the training pipeline. Barbers Point expanded operations to 24 hours, with aircraft in constant rotation between flights. The most significant challenge was maintaining the program's effectiveness at scale. Thatch understood that his personal supervision had been a key factor in the initial success. Now he needed to systematize his approach so that it would work with dozens of instructors and hundreds of students. The solution came in the form of a comprehensive but radically streamlined training manual, just 26 pages compared to the conventional program's 342. It emphasized practical skills over theory, structured in a day-by-day progression that left no room for drift or delay. Perhaps most revolutionary was Thatch's insistence on standardized instructor practices. Previously, each instructor had considerable latitude in how they taught various skills. Thatch mandated specific language, demonstrations, and evaluation criteria to ensure every student received identical instruction, regardless of which instructor they flew with. "You're turning instructors into interchangeable parts," observed Lieutenant Commander Widhelm as they reviewed the new protocols. "Some of the old hands won't like that." "They don't have to like it," Thatch replied. "They just have to follow it. We're not running a flying club, we're building a standardized combat pilot production line." By September 19, 1943, the first class of the fully implemented accelerated program graduated. 184 newly minted Hellcat pilots stood at attention on the Barbers Point tarmac as Admiral Nimitz himself presented their wings. Among them was Ensign Thomas Riley, now designated for assignment to Fighter Squadron 17 aboard the USS Hornet. After the ceremony, Admiral Nimitz requested a private briefing with Thatch. "Remarkable achievement, Commander," the Admiral said as they walked among the parked Hellcats. "From concept to full implementation in just 3 months. Tell me honestly, are these boys truly ready for combat?" Thatch chose his words carefully. "They're ready for their first combat deployment, Admiral. They'll need seasoning and experience, but they have the fundamental skills to survive their initial engagements and contribute effectively to their squadrons. The Hellcat's superior performance over the Zero gives them a technological edge that helps compensate for their limited experience." Nimitz nodded thoughtfully. "Well, we'll know soon enough. The first of your graduates ship out tomorrow for Operation Galvanic. The Gilbert's campaign will be their baptism of fire." In the weeks that followed, Thatch continued refining and expanding the program while anxiously awaiting news from the fleet. The first combat reports began arriving in late November as Task Force 58 engaged Japanese forces defending Tarawa and Makin in the Gilbert Islands. On December 3, 1943, Captain Beakley called Thatch to his office. His expression was unreadable as he handed over a classified action report from Rear Admiral Charles Pownall, commander of the carrier force at Tarawa. Thatch's hands were uncharacteristically unsteady as he opened the folder. These were the first comprehensive results from his accelerated pilots in actual combat conditions. Everything he had worked for, every unconventional decision he had championed, would be validated or condemned by the contents. The report began with a statistical summary: 117 Hellcat sorties flown by accelerated program pilots during the Gilbert's operation. 28 enemy aircraft confirmed destroyed against 3 Hellcats lost, a 9-to-1 victory ratio. Carrier qualification performance rated as satisfactory with an 86% successful landing rate on first approach compared to the fleet average of 91% for experienced pilots. Thatch flipped to Admiral Pownall's narrative assessment. The performance of the accelerated training program pilots exceeded expectations in all combat metrics. While occasional deficiencies were noted in non-critical areas such as formation precision and radio discipline, their tactical proficiency and basic airmanship were comparable to pilots with significantly more experience. Of particular note was their performance in carrier recovery operations under adverse conditions following strike missions, an area traditionally requiring extensive experience. The report concluded, based on observed combat performance, the accelerated Hellcat training program appears to be producing pilots of acceptable combat readiness in 1/3 the traditional time. Recommend program continuation and expansion as fleet requirements dictate. Thatch looked up from the report, meeting Captain Beakley's gaze. The captain was finally smiling. "Congratulations, Jim. You've done the impossible." Thatch felt a complex mixture of pride, relief, and humility. "The pilots did the impossible, sir. I just changed the way we prepared them. The validation from the fleet triggered the final phase of Thach's transformation of Navy fighter training. What had begun as an experimental program with 50 students was now established as the standard method for all Hellcat pilots in the Pacific Theater. Training facilities expanded to naval air stations across Hawaii and the West Coast. By January 1944, as Operation Flintlock, the invasion of the Marshall Islands, commenced, over 600 accelerated program graduates were serving in frontline squadrons. Their performance continued to validate Thach's approach, with combat effectiveness metrics consistently matching or exceeding those of conventionally trained pilots. Perhaps the most telling metric came in the form of a letter Thach received from Commander David McCampbell, commanding officer of Air Group 15 aboard USS Essex. McCampbell, who would go on to become the Navy's top ace with 34 aerial victories, wrote, "Your pilots arrive in the combat zone with precisely the skills they need most: effective gunnery, sound tactical judgment, and solid carrier landing capability. Whatever they lack in polish, they make up for in practical proficiency. Most importantly, they demonstrate a remarkable ability to learn quickly from operational experience, suggesting your training methods have taught them not just how to fly but how to adapt and improve under combat conditions." The culmination of Thach's revolution in fighter pilot training came on March 10, 1944. Admiral Nimitz signed Naval Pacific Fleet Order 744, officially adopting the Accelerated Combat Readiness Training Program as the standard for all naval aviators in the Pacific Theater. The order stated, "Commander Thach's innovative approach to aircrew training has proven highly effective in meeting the urgent personnel requirements of our carrier forces. By focusing training resources on combat-critical skills, emphasizing practical application over theory, and implementing standardized instruction methods, the program has successfully compressed the training timeline while maintaining acceptable readiness standards." The order continued. Effective immediately, all naval aviation training commands in the Pacific Theater will implement the accelerated program methods and standards as detailed in COMARPAC Training Manual 43A. Training commands are directed to prioritize early introduction of carrier landing practice, high-volume, high-intensity flight operations, combat-oriented tactical instruction, standardized evaluation criteria, and rapid identification and reassignment of underperforming candidates. What had begun as a desperate improvisation was now official doctrine. Thach's willingness to challenge established training methods, his confidence in the ability of young pilots to learn faster when taught differently, and his unwavering focus on combat-relevant skills had transformed naval aviation training. By war's end, over 3,700 fighter pilots would graduate from his accelerated program, pilots who might otherwise have still been in training when their skills were needed most. The impact on the Pacific Air War was profound. The accelerated training program enabled the Navy to maintain fully staffed carrier air groups despite combat losses and the continuous expansion of the carrier fleet. Between June 1943 and August 1945, the number of fleet carriers in the Pacific grew from 7 to 16, requiring a corresponding increase in qualified pilots. Without Thach's training revolution, the Navy would have faced a critical shortage of qualified Hellcat pilots during the crucial campaigns of 1944 and 1945. The conventional training pipeline simply could not have produced enough combat-ready aviators to meet operational demands. In his private journal, Admiral Nimitz would later write, "Commander Thach's contribution to the Pacific victory extended far beyond his tactical innovations. By reimagining how we prepared our pilots for combat, he effectively multiplied our available air power at a critical juncture. While carriers and aircraft can be built given sufficient industrial capacity, combat-capable pilots cannot be manufactured. They must be trained, a process historically constrained by deeply entrenched methods and time frames." Thach's willingness to challenge those constraints when war demands required It exemplifies the adaptability that ultimately secured our victory. The immediate aftermath of Thach's training revolution was measured in statistical terms that military leaders understood well: more pilots, flying more sorties, achieving more victories. But the human dimension of his achievement was best illustrated through the experiences of those who passed through the accelerated program. Ensign Thomas Riley, one of the original 50 students, flew his first combat mission on November 20, 1943, as part of the Tarawa operation. Launching from USS Hornet with Fighter Squadron 17, he encountered Japanese aircraft attempting to attack American landing forces. Despite having just 3 months of total flight time in the Hellcat, Riley shot down 2 enemy aircraft and safely returned to his carrier. "Everything happened exactly as we'd trained," Riley wrote in a letter to Thach afterward. "The combat felt almost familiar because we'd practiced those exact scenarios so intensively. When I saw the Zeros diving toward our troops, I didn't have to think about what to do. My reactions were automatic, just as you said they would be." Riley would survive the war with 7 confirmed aerial victories, becoming an ace and receiving the Distinguished Flying Cross. Hundreds of similar success stories emerged from Thach's graduates, confirming the effectiveness of his training methods under the ultimate test, combat. Not all consequences were immediately apparent, however. Thach's emphasis on early identification of aptitude, what some critics called his ruthless washout policy, resulted in hundreds of student pilots being diverted from fighter training to other aviation roles. This initially created friction, with other training commands suddenly receiving an influx of redirected personnel. Captain Walter Layton, commander of patrol bomber training, complained in a December 1943 memorandum, "We are receiving numerous transfers from Commander Thach's fighter program. While these personnel are generally sound aviators, they arrive with expectations of accelerated training methods that our program is not designed to accommodate." This unintended consequence soon became a catalyst for broader change, as other aviation communities began adopting elements of Thach's methods. By mid-1944, accelerated training approaches had been implemented for dive bomber, torpedo bomber, and patrol aircraft programs throughout the Pacific. For Thach personally, the success of the program brought both recognition and new responsibilities. In April 1944, he was promoted to full commander and awarded the Legion of Merit for his contributions to naval aviation training. The citation read in part, "Commander Thach's innovative training methods have significantly enhanced the combat capability of Navy fighter forces, while addressing critical personnel shortages. His willingness to challenge established practices in pursuit of wartime efficiency exemplifies the highest traditions of naval service." Yet Thach remained characteristically modest. When a war correspondent sought to profile him as the man who revolutionized fighter training, he redirected attention to his students. "The real story is the performance of these young pilots," he insisted. "They're the ones flying into combat with a fraction of the training we once thought necessary." After the war, as the Navy transitioned to peacetime operations, many expected a return to traditional methodical training methods. Instead, the opposite occurred. The accelerated program had demonstrated that focused, intensive training produced pilots who adapted quickly to operational demands. This lesson was not forgotten. In 1946, the newly established Naval Air Training Command published its foundational doctrine, which stated, "The wartime accelerated training program developed by Commander Thach has validated the principle that aviation training should focus primarily on operational proficiency rather than comprehensive technical knowledge." While peacetime conditions permit a more measured training pace, the fundamental emphasis on practical skills acquisition and standardized instruction methods will be maintained. Thach himself returned to operational duties after the war, commanding the aircraft carrier USS Sicily during the Korean conflict and eventually rising to the rank of admiral. Throughout his distinguished career, he continued to advocate for innovation in training methods, arguing that the principles he had developed under wartime pressure remained relevant in peacetime. In a 1955 lecture at the Naval War College, Thatch reflected on the accelerated program's legacy. What we discovered through necessity was actually a more effective approach to training combat aviators. By identifying the truly essential skills, teaching them intensively through practical application, and rigorously evaluating performance, we produced pilots who were better prepared for the chaotic realities of combat than those trained under more theoretical, methodical systems. This philosophy would profoundly influence naval aviation training for decades to follow. The Navy's famous Top Gun program, established in 1969 during the Vietnam War, incorporated many principles first implemented in Thatch's accelerated program. Intensive practical training, immediate application of combat lessons, standardized evaluation criteria, and focus on mission-critical skills. The human impact of Thatch's innovations was perhaps best captured in a reunion of Fighter Squadron 17 veterans held in San Diego in 1967. 24 years after their accelerated training experience, former pilots gathered to commemorate their wartime service. Among them was Captain Thomas Riley, now a commercial airline pilot, who had organized the event. Thatch, by then a rear admiral, was the guest of honor. During the dinner, Riley presented him with a hand-crafted plaque bearing the names of 37 squadron members. "Admiral," Riley said, his voice thick with emotion, "these are the men from our squadron who came home because of your training program. We didn't realize it at the time, but you were preparing us not just to fight, but to survive." This sentiment was echoed in countless letters Thatch received from former students throughout his life. One, written in 1972 by former Ensign William Cooper, the pilot whose training accident had nearly derailed the program, perhaps captured it best. "Your willingness to challenge the established system gave me and thousands of others the skills we needed when it mattered most. After my accident, the old guard wanted to shut you down. Thank God they didn't, because what looked like recklessness to them was actually a profound understanding of what combat pilots truly needed to know." The statistical legacy of Thatch's program is equally compelling. By war's end, Hellcat pilots trained under the accelerated program had achieved a 12-to-1 victory-to-loss ratio against Japanese aircraft, significantly higher than the overall American average. Despite having less total flight time, their combat effectiveness proved equal or superior to conventionally trained pilots. More significantly, the program's efficiency allowed the Navy to meet the enormous personnel demands of its expanding carrier force. Between 1943 and 1945, the number of carrier-based aircraft in the Pacific grew from approximately 800 to over 3,000. Without accelerated training, this expansion would have been impossible to staff with qualified pilots. Beyond statistics and operational impacts, Thatch's program represented a fundamental shift in military thinking about skill acquisition and training efficiency. His approach challenged deeply entrenched assumptions about how long it took to develop combat proficiency, demonstrating that with the right methods, motivated individuals could achieve operational readiness in a fraction of the traditionally required time. This insight would influence military training philosophy far beyond naval aviation. Army, Marine Corps, and Air Force training programs all eventually incorporated elements of Thatch's approach, emphasizing intensive practical application, standardized instruction, and focus on combat essential skills over comprehensive knowledge. As Admiral Thatch noted in his final public address before retirement in 1967, "The most valuable lesson from our wartime training experience wasn't about flying techniques or tactical doctrines. It was the recognition that humans can achieve remarkable proficiency in complex skills much faster than our traditional systems assume possible, if we focus on what truly matters and are willing to discard unnecessary or outdated components." August 15, 1945. As news of Japan's surrender spread across the Pacific, fighter pilots aboard the USS Essex gathered on the ready room to celebrate the end of the long and brutal conflict. Among them was Lieutenant Commander Thomas Riley, now a squadron leader and veteran of 3 major campaigns. As champagne flowed and victory songs echoed through the compartment, Riley found a quiet corner to pen a letter. "Dear Admiral Thatch," he wrote, "today as we celebrate victory, my thoughts return to that first terrifying day at Barber's Point when you put me in a Hellcat with barely enough training to get it off the ground. I thought you were crazy then. Now I understand you were preparing us for a world where perfect training was a luxury we couldn't afford. You taught us that good enough now beats perfect too late. That lesson saved my life countless times over these past 2 years." This tension between thorough preparation and urgent necessity lies at the heart of Thatch's legacy. When confronted with an impossible training timeline, he didn't simply compress the existing program. He fundamentally reimagined what fighter pilot training should be, questioning every assumption and tradition in pursuit of combat effectiveness. The courage required for this approach is easy to overlook. Challenging established military doctrine during wartime carried enormous professional risk. Had his accelerated program resulted in higher casualty rates or degraded combat performance, Thatch's promising career would have ended in disgrace. Yet he recognized that the greater risk lay in adhering to peacetime standards when war demanded innovation. This willingness to assume personal risk for institutional improvement exemplifies a particular kind of military leadership, one that balances respect for tradition with the flexibility to adapt when circumstances demand it. Thatch never disparaged the conventional training system or the dedicated officers who had developed it. He simply recognized that different conditions required different approaches. The accelerated fighter training program ultimately produced over 3,700 combat-ready Hellcat pilots between June 1943 and August 1945. These aviators accumulated more than 145,000 combat sorties, destroyed approximately 4,700 enemy aircraft, and helped secure American air supremacy across the Pacific theater. Beyond these impressive statistics lies a deeper truth about innovation in military affairs. The most effective innovations often come not from advanced technology or increased resources, but from reconceptualizing how existing assets are employed. Thatch didn't have access to better aircraft, more fuel, or additional instructors than the conventional program. His advantage lay entirely in his willingness to question fundamental assumptions about how pilots learn and what they truly needed to know. This lesson remains relevant for military organizations today. In an era of accelerating technological change and evolving threats, the temptation to seek solutions through advanced systems is strong, yet Thatch's example reminds us that how we train and prepare personnel, the human dimension of warfare, often matters more than the tools they employ. Perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Thatch's story is how close his training revolution came to never happening. Had Captain Beakley rejected his initial proposal, had the safety review panel shut down the program after Ensign Cooper's accident, or had Admiral Nimitz insisted on maintaining traditional training standards, thousands of pilots might have remained in training pipelines while carriers sailed shorthanded into combat. This raises a provocative question for all who study military history and leadership. How many potential innovations go unrealized because traditions prove too powerful to overcome? How many James Thachs never find the opportunity or support to challenge established doctrines, even when operational realities demand new approaches? Would you have broken with decades of established training doctrine as Thatch did, risking your career and potentially pilots' lives on an unproven approach? Or would you have insisted on maintaining standards developed through years of peacetime experience? Comment below and share this story so others remember what courage really means. Not just the physical bravery of combat pilots, but the moral courage of leaders willing to challenge systems when lives and victory hang in the balance.